All right, in this video, I am going to show you the editor, the process, kind of the thought process that I go through when editing a typical ATA blog post. So I don't intend it to be, it's not going to be perfect by any means, since every ATA blog post it's a little bit different, but hopefully if you can watch this and kind of follow my thought process and try to get your head around kind of the concept of what it means to write a good ATA blog post, hopefully it'll be easier. All right, so I'm going from the top. First up, this is an article, Getting Started with Azure Functions, Example-Driven Guide by Jeff Brown. And the target keyword here is Azure Functions Tutorial. First up, whenever you start a blog, before you even start reading it, always get the title and the keyword in your head. Because the first thing you need to think about is searcher intent. Put your mind in the head. Put your head in the mind of the reader. So, for example, 80-something% of the traffic through ATA comes through Google and other search engines. So they're probably going to come to get your article through Google. And they're going to use Azure Functions Tutorial because that's the keyword that we're targeting. So you think about the person that would search for Azure Functions Tutorial. Well, first up, they didn't just search for Azure, they searched for Azure Functions. So you can assume that, okay, they probably know what Azure is. They niched down a little bit. So niching is a different kind of concept, but essentially, if they search for Azure Functions, you can assume a few things. Number one, they probably already know about the cloud. They probably already know maybe generally what Azure is and what you can do with it. And they want to learn about Azure Functions. They are a beginner. Since they put tutorial in the keyword, that means that they are probably a bare beginner and they just want to learn how to get started and just learn some very basic information just to kind of springboard their learning so they can learn through other resources. And they are, when the title, they're going to search for that. They're going to see my page. They're going to see the blog post in Google, and they're going to see Getting Started with Azure Functions, Example-Driven Guide. So what does that tell you? Well, that tells me, number one, getting started. That's a good term there to say this is going to be a tutorial for bare beginners. That's the scope, bare beginners. What that means for you is that you need to make sure that all of the bases are covered in the text. The writer properly defines everything and make sure that a beginner doesn't get lost. Example-driven guide, you're going to have to make sure that there is at least one good how-to example in here. Example-driven guide, which makes me kind of think about, well, this is going to need to be multiple examples, which hopefully every ATA blog post needs to be, because we try to teach by example and by action, and lots of how-tos. All right, with that being said, now we have the tags excerpt. You have to put these in here. Tags excerpt category, fairly simple. If you've been meaning to learn Azure Functions, you're in luck. Learn how to. This is pretty much the same on all of them. Learn how to do this or how to do this. It just need to make sure that the keyword, the target keyword, is in the excerpt somewhere. So Azure Functions Tutorial, just kind of mirror that this is. All right. So going down here, next I check the steps. So I've already put a few comments up here. I'll skip those for now. But first up, I start from the top, the intro. First, this is what I will do sometimes. I will go to / and then do a TOC to make a comment, table of contents. And then you can see the overall structure of what the post looks like. We have understanding, getting to know, comparing functions, creating Azure log function, blah, blah, blah. Now, typically, this is a getting started guide. The getting started guides are a little bit different than the titles that start with how to. The getting started guide has a lot more understanding. I call it understanding content up top. Just the background information of what it is, not how to do things. So typically, if this were a how-to guide, and I saw understanding, maybe this is okay, but then I saw this, and all this, I would say that this is not going to be, this is not going to work. He needs to integrate this into the functions or create another examples. But in this example, it looks like it's pretty good because this is a getting started guide. You need to provide at least the first quarter, well, at most the first quarter of the post needs to be background information, just like what he had. Getting to know, this is a trigger, this is a binding, this is a hosting plan. So they need to learn those terms up front, which then he will then use in the demos because, typically I like to put the to define all that stuff as you're going through in the demos, but since this is a getting started guide, well, a little bit different. So first up, you look at the general structure here. To me, this looks fine for a getting started guide. He's got the it's showing action, so each header has understanding, getting to know, comparing, creating. I like the ing one because they show that inside of the section or the header, they're going to be they're going to know something. I mean, they're going to have some kind of action. It's not just, this just isn't Azure Functions, or this isn't serverless offerings. It's really boring. We want to encourage, action and learning and going forward. So he has that quite a bit. And then here, H3 headers, these are really good. This is one thing that you need to pay attention to, especially on these longer ones. You can have an unlimited number of H2s and H3s. Break them up as much as possible. The only thing that's maybe different is if you have really small ones, but we'll cover all that. All right, so once we figure out the structure, now I just start from the top via the introduction. So in my head, I read it in my head. Azure Functions is event-driven serverless. Okay, first thing, the first 5 words, I know that there's going to be a problem here because the intro needs to be the hook. It needs to provide, it needs to give the reader a question or a reason to actually do this. So here, then I already made a comment, good info, but who cares? Why should I read more? What is Azure Functions going to do for me? It's all about not what the topic is, but what is it going to do for the reader? How is it going to solve a reader's problem? It's not the problem that the reader has is not that he learns, not that he doesn't know he doesn't know about Azure Functions, but it's more about what he can do with Azure Functions. What can he do with serverless? It's kind of a higher level of abstraction, if you will. So this is the kind of comment that I will put in here. 1 paragraph comment, great intro, hooks the reader into learning more, references their problem. So this is what I would do here. I would just completely stop reading after this because I know it's not a good intro. It doesn't have a good hook. And then the second paragraph looks good. In this article, you will learn, that's the typical thing. The second paragraph just needs to be the summary of you will learn about serverless concept, Azure Function component, and follow up a tutorial. It's kind of boring because it doesn't provide a lot of action. For me, not a big deal, but I would say you will learn how to do this or how to do this or how to apply this rather than you will learn about. That's not direct. It's not, it doesn't show any action. It's just simply is just boring. You think, learn about this. That's just general boring documentation. But all right, so I'm not going to go down through any comments because it'll take forever if I comment out of these things, but I'm just going to just kind of go through my thought process here. All right, so for the first one, first off, this is an H2, heading 2, so we have to make sure that's there. And then I'm going to do that. Then if that's not an H2, then I will go down through here and I would typically check the other ones because they tend to have a bad habit. So yeah, he has H2s and H3s in there, so that's good. All right, and first up, understanding serverless cloud computing. Like I said, that's generally not going to be the case. You're not going to have a lot of information. So again, we need to keep it action oriented, get to the action as soon as possible, get to showing them how to do this as soon as possible. So right now he has, he's got a fair amount of information about this. Instead, he gets down to here where he gets the actual how-to stuff. So, typically I would just not do this, but this is a getting started article. So we definitely need to encourage this. All right, so first up, understanding serverless cloud computing. So what does the title say? The title says understanding in the ATA terms is pretty much, we're not going to show you how to do something, we're just going to tell you about something. So I kind of think of that intention in my head. And first up, serverless computing allows you to, okay, so this is what I do right here. Everybody has a problem with the introductions for some reason. It's not, they tend to just immediately jump into things. That the transitions are hard. It's think of each of these sections as sort of like a little story into and of itself, a little mini blog post inside of a blog post. Whenever you read this, understanding serverless cloud computing, and then immediately go into serverless cloud computing allows you to run code, allows you to, this tells me right here that this isn't being treated as a guide. You're not talking to someone whenever you start a sentence with, when you talk to someone, do you say serverless computing allows you to run code in the cloud? No, you're not going to tell someone that. You're going to introduce things. You're going to say something like, if you've ever, let's just see what he says. Serverless cloud allows you to, it is serverless in the sense that you do not need to install or maintain servers in the cloud. So I would break that out and say, if you is a big one because you're always addressing your reader. If you're tired of maintaining servers and infrastructure, not to worry. Because say something like serverless cloud computing may be for you, or something like that. So it puts in you in here. If you're tired of maintaining servers infrastructure, this is kind of what that is since you do not need to install or maintain servers in the cloud. This transforms this documentation to the introduction. So this is introducing what, again, kind of like a hook of a solution to the problem that you're going to be talking about in here. That kind of, if you're tired, that's one thing, is the problem. Like, why do I care about understanding serverless cloud computing? It sounds boring on the surface. They need to talk more about, you need to talk to the person, guide them, not write it as documentation like this. All right, in a sense, do you not need to install or maintain servers to run? All right, first up, the code. This is another big one that that writers have a problem with. Whenever you say that means, that typically infers that it is one single thing. If you say the chair, that means you're talking about one single chair, and you're probably going to be talking about one single chair throughout the entire blog post. If you say a chair, that infers that you may be talking about other chairs in the blog post. So right here, he is saying that you do need to install and maintain servers to run the code. First up, he hasn't even introduced, this is another big one that writers do, they don't introduce concepts before they talk about them. So he's saying serverless computing, so that's fine, because he can say serverless computing because he said serverless computing platform up here. He's got to give him the reader of an idea of what it shows, what he's going to talk about. Allows you to run code. You can infer that somebody that's reading wanting to know about Azure Functions, they probably know what code is. We're going very basic here, but this is the kind of things you need to keep in your head. They're probably going to know what code is. They're probably going to know what the cloud is because of what they were searching for. It is serverless in the sense that this is bad in the sense that that's wordy. There's lots of different ways to put that, but I'm not going to go down to copy editing or anything like that in this video. But you do not need to install servers in the cloud to run the code. What code? The first thing I asked myself as I read through this, I'm questioning, what is that going to be? To run the code. What is the code? So I would wonder what that is, and I would immediately, you could say something like remove that to run code. Code is general, it's generic. The code is not going to be there. The code, then I would make this code. All right, let's see. Code runs on servers hosted by the cloud provider. So this is boring. Cloud codes runs on servers hosted by the cloud provider. Great. You write and deploy code without worrying about the infrastructure required to execute it. Starting a sentence with you doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound like you're talking to someone. You don't come up to somebody and say, you write code and deploy. You would say, in this instance, code runs on servers hosted by the cloud provider. I would transition that to say, you're saying code runs on servers hosted by the cloud provider. What that word? You can, I like you can, especially in these intros. You can run this code and also deploy it without worrying about all the infrastructure required to actually execute the code, something like that. It kind of transitions that that paragraph a little bit more. All right, continue down. Serverless. Okay, this serverless also. Serverless. You've been talking about serverless, but you haven't used serverless as a noun. Previously up here, you said a serverless compute platform, serverless computing. You didn't actually say serverless. You didn't, allude to what serverless is. So we needed to add serverless computing, because some people do use the term just serverless as a noun without serverless computing, which is fine, but he needs to say this up here, serverless computing, or he could say, also known as serverless or something like that. He could put that up here, but he needs to be strict throughout here so we don't lose anybody. All right, serverless computing also eliminates the infrastructure barrier for developers. First up, infrastructure barrier. What the hell is an infrastructure barrier? That's not clear. Let's see if he goes on to define it. Servers are still running code, but developers. So he says the infrastructure barrier for developers, then he backs it up. So this is okay, because he says eliminates the infrastructure barrier. This could be worded differently to say eliminates the need for developers to manage their own servers and infrastructure. It needs to be more detailed instead of saying this infrastructure barrier. Servers are still running the code, I would take that out, but developers no longer need to worry about them. Servers are still running the code. Is it the code that you're talking about, them or servers? Probably servers in this case, but developer no need to worry about them. This is another one. I try not to encourage using them, this, they, those. I can't remember the exact term for it, but those nouns, those words are essentially pointer words to other things, and it makes the text much. It's a lot less clear when you say worry about the servers or something like that. It's clearer when you say that. All right, it's they. Here's another one. They can. Is it? If you read this quickly, you think they can. Right? Is it? Who's they? Are the servers, or they are the developers? I'm not for sure. So it's just easier to always put developers can quickly deploy code instead of they. Try to really encourage not using they, them, this, that, and really encourage using the actual subjects of what it's pointing to. They can quickly deploy code without waiting for system administrators to install servers, patch operating systems, or configure networking. That's pretty good, because he's saying eliminates the infrastructure barrier. I'm sure he can word it differently. He's saying that developers have to worry about code. He is kind of niching down a little bit and saying serverless is for developers in this paragraph. Not a big deal, but he's saying, okay, they can deploy code without waiting for system administrators. He's saying something and then he's backing it up with an example. So this is a fairly good overall here, because he's saying this. He's defining, stating something, and then he's backing up. They can quickly deploy code without waiting for network. So he's elaborating a little bit. So that's pretty good. All right. A primary characteristic of serverless, gonna say computing. Here's another one that I typically will look at and try to find a different way to do. I call this without lack of a better word, a ... is statement. So lots of people tend to do they say a subject is, and then they go along with it. There's 99% of the time a much better way that sounds better than saying that. So let me give you an example on this one. So let's say that he's saying a primary character service is only paying for the compute resources needed to execute the code. All right, so compare that sentence with let's see. It's paying for the, again, he can add you here. So let's say that you're actually talking to someone. That subject is sentence is not talking to someone. It's not conversational. So you would say, let's see, is only paying for, if you're, let's see, is only paying for the compute needed to execute the code. If you're paying more than you need to for compute resources, serverless eliminates that by blah, 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 by not needing you to install it. So if you're, again, it's you, replacing these is sentences with something like you. You're talking to someone. This consumption model. Okay, what is a consumption model? When you say this consumption model, what is a consumption model? That's too fancy. I would just remove that completely and just say this scenario, I don't know, something like that. Consumption model, way too fancy. Saves cost by only using compute resources when required. That just kind of says the same thing as the previous sentence. You no longer have to have servers sitting idle waiting for something to happen. You only pay for the resources when you need them. He repeated himself over and over and over in this. You could probably eliminate all this paragraph down to one sentence. Okay, here's another one. Another characteristic of serverless is that can be rewarded. That subject is, that's can always be rewarded. It just, you're not talking to someone when you just think of, someone walking up in the street. What's Azure Functions? Another characteristic of serverless is auto scaling. You don't just say that. You would say something like, well, if you do want to learn, if you do want to use, one of the big benefits of serverless is auto scaling. Something like that. It's you're talking to someone. Serverless can meet changes in demand by providing more resources to execute the code. This is just really boring documentation. Developers and administrators no longer need to worry about installing more servers and deploying code as demand changes. Serverless solutions also auto-scale down to when demand divides. This right here, he's changed flows. He's changed this, not the story, but he's changed the concepts. Here, he was talking about scaling up. Here, when you say serverless solutions also, that kind of reads to me, it's like he just tacked it on at the end without anything else. Serverless solutions also auto scale down when demand subsides. That's great, but it feels like it's kind of tacked on to the end of the paragraph. It doesn't really feel like it's been given any kind of weight. All right, continue on. Getting to know Azure Functions. All right, Azure Functions, again, no introduction here. He just jumps right into what looks like documentation. Here, instead of just jumping right in, you could say, let's see here, serverless cloud computing. If serverless is great for running code in the cloud, then Azure's solution is going to be, I don't know, Azure Functions or something like that. Is Azure Functions, something like that. And then you would say Azure Functions is this. So you need to introduce this. He did. I can't think of a better word for introducing, but essentially, this is a transition between this paragraph and this, or this section and this one. If serverless is great for running code in the cloud, this is a summary of what is up here. That sentence connects the sentences, the sections together. It's not so jerky, black and white sort of thing. Like it reads as documentation. If he just says serverless computing allows you to run code, Azure Functions is Microsoft's event-driven serverless solution. That's documentation. It's just boring, black and white. You need to have these introductions. If serverless is great for running some kind of, I don't know, light introduction, then Azure Solutions is your friend, or I don't know, or something like that, is Azure Functions. And then once he transitioned the two, then he can go into this. Azure Functions is Microsoft's event-driven serverless solution. That sounds okay. Here, I would say you can build components. Here, I would connect this to with Azure Functions. You can build. So this is again transition. Azure Functions is this. With Azure Functions, you can build connecting the two sentences together. It's all about having the blog post as one cohesive story or narrative or something like that. Even in sentences, this is important. With Azure Functions, you can build application components into blocks of code or functions that can execute whenever needed. Now that's okay sentence, I think. You can code functions. He's using code as a verb here. I would probably remove that, do something like that. But you can code functions in the Azure portal. See, he's not using the Grammarly Premium, so portal is capitalized. In the Azure portal or on your local system. So that's good to know. You can actually do it in the Azure portal. Azure Functions uses a storage account. See, he's put a bunch of stuff into one paragraph. He's kind of squished it all together. It seems kind of like he's not really elaborating on it. It's not in depth. He's not saying anything about he's not really elaborating anything. That made me think of this thing because he's here and then he says Azure Functions uses a storage account to store code and other function artifacts. First question: what storage account? What are application settings? What are function artifacts? I immediately think of all these other questions in my head. He doesn't necessarily have to elaborate on that. He can just remove this sentence completely. But every sentence needs to be backed up, or some kind of it needs to be elaborated on and discussed more, because especially this may be okay if he introduced this with uses a storage account to store code, and then he had something down here about a storage account to store code, but he has nothing in this section about a storage account to store code. Application settings, you could probably genericize that because everybody knows that application has settings. And other function artifacts. That may not be a good common word for maybe an IT pro, somebody that's not a full-on developer. So I would have him link this to some other kind of article that talked about what artifacts are. So first up, he didn't do a good job with the transition. This seems kind of be bunched together, and here he doesn't have. He doesn't necessarily introduce triggers, bindings, hosting plans, and all this stuff. He doesn't connect this concept with what he's going to talk down here. So if he's going to have triggers, bindings, and all this other stuff, I mean, he could connect this together with saying something like, let's see, Azure Functions requires many components to work. This is terrible, but this is right off the top of my head. Requires many components to work, each working together to blah, 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 blah. Summary of what he's going to be doing here. Azure Function requires many components. Well, those components are triggers, binding, hosting plans, and all this stuff. He needs to summarize. He needs to introduce these headers first. It's still black and white, black, white, black, white, black, white. This. There's no transition. There's no connecting them whatsoever. The whole blog post from top all the way to bottom needs to be connected in a better, using a better word for it, in some manner. All right, triggers, every function. So this is okay. Here, he went right into every function must include a trigger. That doesn't have the introduction. For the introduction and connecting the sections, I think those are most important when the H2s. When you have an H3, you don't want to constantly be introducing what it is in the H3 because they could be small. I think this is okay when it comes to H3s, just simply because it's just going to seem repetitive over and over. That's, you want to include introductions on sections, but you don't want to make them seem repetitive and just boring. And I think it's okay to do that in for H3s. All right, so first thing that I had to do, this is another thing that I noticed. Every Azure function must include a trigger. He went right into a single component of what they are: triggers, binding, hosting plans. Well, up to this point, all he's talked about is just general serverless, and that you don't need the infrastructure. He hasn't taken a step back and give us a broad overview of what Azure Functions is. Like, Azure Functions, like I had before, let me get this back, requires many components to work together to blah, 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 blah. An Azure function consists of triggers, bindings, whatever. To kick off the Azure function, you need a trigger. That trigger then does this with bindings, and then connect host plan and languages. Essentially, he needs to summarize how each of these are built together to give the reader an idea, like kind of a cohesive picture in their mind of what these are. If he just says each Azure function must include a trigger, I didn't even know Azure function had a trigger. I see that it must include a trigger. Okay, I know that it must include a trigger. The trigger executes the function code whenever a trigger meets these conditions. That sounds legit, but I didn't even know there was a trigger on Azure function. What does the trigger, how does the trigger fit in the bigger scheme of an Azure function? This is one of the big things a lot of people don't do. They don't provide that kind of summary up top and give you an idea of kind of a summary of how each of these are built together, and then go over each of the components. Again, this kind of reads like documentation: triggers, bindings, hosting plans. He needs to first summarize what he's going to talk about in the broad overall context thing, talking very simply, and then he goes into each of the components. All right, let's assume he said that. Every functional trigger, functional whenever there meets the conditions. Examples of events include, this is good. Examples are always good. This is good. Events include, and he's got lists. He's got good. He built these out. Variety is also good. He doesn't just have headers and text. He has some lists here. So lists are like these are highly encouraged. Examples of events include receiving and running on a schedule, running on a blog storage. That's wrong, but blob storage is the first time he talked about blob storage. So whenever you talk about a concept that not just your general IT pro or help desk person may understand, always link to that. So I would say please link to blob storage to include that in case they don't know what that is. Azure Event Grid as an Azure service, he needs to link to that. Running an event in the Azure Event Grid subscription. See, somebody will have no idea what that is unless it had a link. Read more about event triggers in this. That's good, I guess, but whenever he says the first time he mentioned triggers, this needs to be under here. So every function must include a trigger, and he should have put this link here behind this instead of being explicit. Read more about it. Needs to be kind of in the background a little more. Bindings, functions. So, function to connect without minimal coding. I so he meant with minimal coding can have multiple input and output. But bindings allow functions to connect to other Azure resources, services without. It's not getting generic enough. He's not allow functions to connect to other Azure resources. Here I would say Azure Functions can also connect to other Azure resources. They do this via bindings because he hasn't introduced Azure services. He didn't, so the reader doesn't even know that Azure Functions can interface with Azure resources services. So I first say this first. With minimal coding, Azure Functions can have input and output bindings. So he says can have input and output binding, and then he says using bindings. When he says this can have multiple input output bindings, he needs to define input and output bindings. He needs to just have one sentence that says input and output bindings allow you to blah blah blah, whatever. So miss that. Using bindings in a function it will enable you to, this is wordy, will enable you to, that's always wordy. You can use binding in the functions to avoid, that would be easier. Hard coding access to other services. I didn't even know that I could dynamically code something to other services. This article's tutorial, that's two things. I would just say this tutorial uses an output binding to a table in a storage account. What's a table? And then I would probably maybe link to an Azure Docs for the storage account. This tutorial, I would say, as shown later, alluding to and kind of letting them know they're going to be doing that later, uses an output binding to a table. Yeah, that's not entirely clear. Hosting plans, Azure Functions operate. I think Azure Functions is actually a singular, but anyway, operate using hosting plans, generic. I would say Azure Functions do this thing and can solve this sort of problem and do this with hosting plans. Azure Functions operate using hosting plans. That's really generic, really vague. It needs to be clearer. The hosting plans determine how the function app. Function app. What is a function app? You've been saying Azure Functions the whole time. You never said what a function app is. They probably need to be up here somewhere to say that inside of Azure Functions, you have an app. This app does this, blah, blah, blah. Introduce the concept of function app. Right now, nobody knows what a function app is. The hosting plan determine how the function app scales. Scales up and down. You have mentioned this already, so that's good. Resources available to each function app. I would say resources like blah and blah to give more information, and advanced feature functionality such as blah and blah. That's always good to have examples. What is advanced feature functionality? What are the resources? There are, another big one, he's not talking. There are 3 main hosting plans. That's just documentation. You can, when setting up an Azure Functions account, you can have 3 different hosting plans. So I'm just talking to someone. Consumption, automatically scaling and pay, and only pay for when the function is running. Useful when running function apps continuously, access to more CPU and memory options. So access to more is relative. You could say, come up here because he's, I assume he's referencing this up here, saying you could say something like, with the consumption plan, you have access to only this and this and this CPU resources. So he's just saying more with that. And memory options. What are the memory options? Virtual network connectivity. He doesn't have to explain each of these, but he should put some links in here so we can learn some more information about these plans. So I mean, I know Microsoft has a lot of documentation on this, so he needs more links, lots of links, just to answer the question. Dedicated run functions and Azure App Service plans. What's an app service plan? It needs to link to there. For predictive scaling, you said scaling. What is predictive? I don't know what predictive is. You need to explain that. And cost, as well as long-running applications. Long-running applications. What's a long-running application? 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 5 minutes, 5 days. Simple little stuff like that really makes a difference, because it really establishes the writer's authority, and it goes in depth. It's examples like what is a long run. It's constantly questioning. All right, supported languages. Azure Function currently supports 3 versions of the, what the hell is a runtime host? Of the runtime host. I don't know what a runtime host is. He needs to introduce that up here. 1.2 by default, Azure sets the runtime version. What is a runtime version? You didn't say that up here. Okay, I want to support 3 versions. Here we go. Yeah, I did say that. Sets it to a default address to 3 when creating functions in the portal and the Azure CLI. This will be a good plot for a related link that we have some information on Azure CLI. He needs a link. He has a major linking problem. He doesn't link very much out. He needs to link more, I've noticed. You should run your functions in the latest supported version. This is a big no-no. You should run your functions in the latest supported version of the function runtime. And that's it. He just says, do this. Doesn't back it up with anything. Why? Why should I do this? Why is it important? Even if it's completely obvious, have one sentence to say why. All functions will be in the same all functions will be in the same language. What is all functions? All functions in an app? All functions in a subscription? I don't know what all functions means. Azure Functions supports several programming languages in version 3.0. Okay. So, yeah, it should be fine. Normally, I would say link to this, but you don't want to link to every single one of these. It becomes repetitive. So, I don't know. I'd say that's okay. Application Insights. That is another link. He needs to link that. Azure Functions uses Application Insights to, I would say, uses a service to monitors all Azure services called Application Insights. He needs to introduce this. He's assuming that people know what Application Insights is. Gathers generated by including information rights to law. Good. Other insights are not a requirement to deploy. This is an off. This is a call out. Azure, it's not a requirement to deploy function apps. I would probably make something like that a call out. It doesn't seem to be related to the context. Here, however, I hate however, but it's always just replace that but. Without it, what? Without what? You won't be able to view historical data about the performance. Be able to, yeah, I mean, can't, oh, that's not right. You won't be able to, I hate to be able to, but anyway. You can still view the logs. Function app, including everything that writes the log. You can still view logs live. The function app executing for troubleshooting purposes. It seems, it's okay. It seems kind of not dry, but lacking. But I don't know. We're not going over the how-to stuff yet. All right, comparing functions to other Azure serverless offerings. We don't need this. Comparing functions to other serverless offerings. They came here for an Azure Functions tutorial. We don't need to compare to other ones. The only reason that this would maybe work with that, he is referencing something like Azure Automation, Azure Logic Apps down here in the how-to. But I would essentially tell him just kill this whole section. We don't care. Has other Azure Service Log besides functions. This section compares. Yeah, this whole section can go. we're here for an Azure Functions tutorial. We're not here to learn about Azure automation and logic apps and all this. I would completely remove that section. All right, and then finally we get into the good stuff. All right, first up, this is wrong. In this demo, we're doing a demo. I don't know. When you say in this thing or to do this, I would assume he introduced the demo. He needs an introduction to say, something like, now that you know the basics, now that the tutorials covered this or something, blah, blah, blah. Now let's get our hands dirty with the demo or something like that. Then you could say, in this demo, you'll create an event logging function for storing messages in a storage account table. I hope he should have already said something about a storage account table. You trigger the function. You trigger the function. Starting a sentence with you doesn't make sense. You will trigger the function using an HTTP request. The function stores the messages in the table using an output binding. This seems like robotic. That needs to be made more conversational. Prerequisites. Okay, this is good. He's got prerequisites under here, unlike it's usually up here. Keep prerequisites down as far as you can if it's not a specific how-to article. If you don't know following step by step, you need a following. Azure tenant and subscription. He would, not a big deal, but he could put the link to a free subscription here, saying if you don't have an Azure subscription, you don't use the free account. An account with contributor, this is good. A lot of people don't do this. They don't actually put the permissions that they need on this subscription. And you can go the extra mile here. It'd be better to say, account this. Here's how you check how you have those accounts. So it's all about answering the reader's question, helping them out with everything possible that they can. So I would say, here's an article or something. You check them how to check this information. PowerShell knowledge. Prerequisites should never have knowledge in here. You can completely remove this. Any amount of knowledge is not soft prerequisite. It's hard tools, hardware, that sort of thing needs to be in prerequisite. So this could be completely removed. All right. Continue on. All right. Step 1. So I would probably remove the steps. Step 1, step 2, not a big deal, but doesn't really fit the same style guide that most of our posts do. Create a resource group. I'd say creating a resource group, not a big deal. But let's see. First, you need to need a resource group for storing the solution. So this is okay. He did make a good attempt at this intro. It's going to say what do they want to do, why did you want to do it. You need a resource group for storing solution components. Well, what is a solution component? You could probably get more detail with that. And then to create a resource group, he's transitioned that. So this is an okay introduction. Log into the Azure portal. Okay. I always say to start from an open desktop. So I would say open your favorite web browser. And log into the Azure portal using your, first up, administrator credentials. Up here, he said, we need contributor or owner permission. Well, what is administrator credentials? He needs to, what is that? We need to, I would just say your user account instead of administrator credentials. Okay, in the search bar, enter resource groups and select the matching service. That's all right. And the resources group, that's good. He did this bold, so that should be bold. See up here. Click create. This should be number 3. That's off for some reason. Oh, because he didn't tab it over. There we go. Resource group, click plus create, select your subscription, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I guess he's thinking these need to be in here. I normally don't like to do that, but enter user screen and choose the Azure region, blah, blah, blah. That's okay, I guess. You can select create. Okay, this is one thing that people don't do. In this instance, it's not a big deal, but it's really good to get in the habit of this. before you say click review create and then create, here I always try to say, as you can see below, blah, 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 the resource group is going to creating in the tutorials. This tutorials resource group is going to be called RG80 function in the West 2 region. It's always just good to summarize what you're talking about up here in here, because you're just assuming click review relates to create. You're just assuming that this is related to this. It's all about not assuming anything, being completely transparent and clear. Okay, that probably needs to be tabbed over. Yep. Storage account. Next, you need a storage account for storing the function code and app. That's good. You need one for store. And then why do you need one? Storing the function code and application insights log. Did you even say we're going to use insights log? I don't know. Back in the Azure portal, search for storage accounts like service, blah, blah, blah. I mean, this is a common thing. He probably doesn't need to go through each of these steps. Creating a resource group, creating a storage account, that's all common stuff. I mean, you could even link to another blog post on how to do that. I mean, I would even say to reduce the size, I would look at the count. I mean, the word count is 3,000 words already. It's a big article. So I would almost say not a big deal since he's already got it already, but I might say just remove these sections completely. Create a storage account. Yeah, I mean, this is just prereqs to what he's doing. So I would say let's remove these and then have the steps of create a storage account and then link to an ATA article, preferably, or some other kind of external site that shows you how to create a storage account and how to create a resource group, and just say that, you know, this post will be used this, we'll use these settings in there to remove a lot of this stuff. All right, create a function app. This is what we're here for with the other components in place. So this is good. He kind of introduced it. Next what? You'll next need to do, don't know that is creating a function app. Why is that capitalized there and it doesn't capitalize other places? For storing the PowerShell function. I don't know if he ever even said that we were going to be using a PowerShell function. In that should be Azure portal. In the Azure portal, search for function app and select the matching service. Create. Click create and then create into the following. That's okay. Select the resource group. He would just say, in this tutorial, we're using this resource group. Into the global unit, note the function app uses when somebody says note, that's probably going to be a call out. So that should probably be a call out there. That all functions in this app will use public. Should be published. Yeah. Select code. Why? Leave the default version. Why? Runtime stack. Why? I see this one. That's obvious. Select the resource group. Why? But he doesn't say why in a lot of these. In the hosting tab, change. All right. So yeah, these should probably be an ordered list. He didn't have an ordered list in here, so I would make these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Change the storage option to leave the plan at. In the hosting tab, change the storage option to the created instant. Why? Leave the plan type at consumption, meaning you will only pay for when the function executes. That's okay. He kind of gave the meaning of why on that one. If your function app requires powerful instances or long running, why would it need this? And what is a long running scenario? Consider using, that's good that he actually linked there this time though. In monitor tab, set the option for enabling application insights to yes. Why? If you have an existing, select from otherwise. Be nice to have a key screenshot here because I don't see. He goes to screenshot over here, but he doesn't give us the screenshots for the monitoring thing, and that's fairly important. For otherwise, uncheck all the settings, like associated. Okay. All right, here's another one. Step 4, create the function. But here's where he needs to differentiate. His step 3 was create the function app. You see that they can get easily confused when you say create the function app without actually saying what a function app is. And then down here say create the function. Well, apparently a function app and a function are different. He needed to introduce that up earlier. In the function app, navigate. All right, so in the function app, where is in the function app? Does once the deployment collect, go to resource. Okay, that's okay. Navigate to, they should be 2 dashes. Functions, and select add to create your first function. So here is where he should probably take a step back and say, inside of the function app, you have functions, blah, blah, blah. This is where you put your code. He needs to introduce this information in here and then go into that. Okay, this needs to be an ordered list, 1, 2, I don't know if he has more than 3. Which will show just details. And select function as the authorization level. What is an authorization level? Okay, there we go. The function authorization level creates an access key specifically for executing this function. That's okay. Click add to create the function. Okay, yeah. Add table output. We're coding the function, create an output. All right, so he's saying before create an output, he's saying immediately to do it, which is good, but he needs to introduce. What are you going to do? What is the output binding? Provide a summary up top. For logman, output binding allows you, so that's good. And he goes into this, and then he says the output binding allows the function to, he elaborates what he was saying. This is great. A lot of people don't do this. Access the table sort without worrying about authentication or, okay, worrying about authentication or connection strings. That's kind of that's one step removed from what he actually needs to say. He needs to say without worrying about how to connect to databases with, authentication or connection string. He's a little bit more specific. U reference, don't start your sentence with a U. U reference, I would just say, next up, you'll need to reference the output binding in the code. To do that, you would do, that whatever you're doing. The function kicks here. Okay, yeah. Function window, select integration. All right. Let's see if there's any other major things we need to go through. Here we go. So let's skip down here. Request. Okay, what the? So he's totally went into something else. In the function window, code test. Remove all the code except for the first few lines. The using statement imports. He needs to have this up here. He's talking about the using statement when I don't even know what the using statement is because it's down here. The request parameter, yeah, all this, he needs to either say in the code snippet below to know where I'm going to be talking about, where these are. You need, that's another bad one. Finally create. Okay, let me. All right, so finally create an output message. So it's good he's being direct. What's this? To link to repo with the full code snippet. Yes, he needs to have that GitHub repo. We don't want to. We need to host all that stuff. Step 7, make the function. You can use save the function in PowerShell. Save the function. This needs to be an ordered list to follow this easier. Wow, this is a long one. Select the logs and closing. That should probably be conclusion, but not a big deal. All right, that should be it. That was kind of a longer one, and I didn't cover everything, but for the most part, hopefully that covered my thought process.